world, and crucially stopping that, not encouraging that. This is a session organised by Global Justice Now and Friends of the Earth England, Wales and Northern Ireland, and is going to be facilitated by myself and Daniel. Daniel, would you like to introduce yourself?
Hello everyone, my name is Daniel Willis. I'm a campaigner on climate justice and international development at Global Justice Now, based in London, UK. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening to everyone. Thank you for joining from all over the world. It seems like we've got approaching 150 participants already, which is fantastic for a Sunday. And yeah, hope you enjoy the session, and we're hoping to make this sort of really interactive and discursive later. So please start thinking of some questions for the speakers.
Definitely, thank you. And before I just introduce myself, I'll also say this is being recorded, so just so you all know that, and you can watch back later along with all the other sessions that you might not have been able to get to. So my name is Rachel, I'm Rachel Kenley, I work for Friends of the Earth England, Wales and Northern Ireland, and I'm the international climate campaigner there. So I work on all the different kind of international aspects of climate change and the UK's role in that. So this session, we're going to look at how governments and institutions, primarily in kind of rich industrialized countries that have done most to cause climate change, are financing fossil fuel expansion and projects in poorer, frequently ex-colonized countries who've done the least to cause climate change. I'm sure this is a dynamic we're all familiar with, but we want to dig into that today. So we're going to talk about how these public and private financial institutions sustain the fossil fuel economy, promote the extraction of fossil fuels around the world, and obviously drive climate change. So in the UK and in Europe, governments and institutions often talk about being climate leaders. You know, we hear this from the UK government a lot, especially at the moment, and they champion their domestic climate action. But really are really happy to keep financing new dirty polluting industries out of sight in other countries. So an example of this is UK Export Finance, which is the government department that financially supports export of goods and businesses and services from the UK in order to secure and create jobs. They spent £762 million on oil and gas services in the last year, and recently signed off $1 billion worth of funding for oil and for gas extraction in Mozambique, and we'll be hearing more about that later. So we want to dig into a bit more about that situation and what's actually happening, but we also want to look at what the impacts are for frontline communities, and what those communities and countries are doing to fight back against this. And we also want to look at how to change these policies and these activities so that funds instead support what we want them to support. So yeah, to make a positive contribution. So we're going to hear from two speakers today. We're going to hear from Laurie from Oil Change International, who's going to been working on the Financing Commons Summit, which was last week. And she can share some of kind of the international perspective around export credit agencies and this financing. And we're also going to hear from Ilham from JAR, or Justica Ambiental, Friends of the Earth Mozambique, about the work that she and JAR are doing on the ground with European partners to resist the Mozambique LNG gas mega project. We were also going to hear from Liddy Nekpil from the Asian People's Movement on Debt and Development, but unfortunately she is sick, so we won't be hearing from her, but we will do our best to highlight and showcase some of the amazing work that's going on in Southeast Asia, particularly around private financing. Dan and I will also speak a little bit about the work that we're doing as well. After we've heard from our speakers, we're then going to move on to a longer question answer reflection session, where we'll try and draw out ideas kind of across the different experiences of our speakers and the different areas that they talk about. So if you do have any questions while you're kind of listening to our speakers, please do pop them in the chat box and we will kind of bring them together and try and incorporate them into our question session. So enough of me for now. I'm going to hand over to Daniel first to talk about his work and some of the situation in the UK.
Great, thank you, Rachel. So, I mean, just to give everyone a sense of the scale of the financing we're talking about, and to, I suppose, particularly draw attention to the role of public finance in the UK, which I think is important, as obviously the UK is going to be hosting the COP26 next year, and increasingly is trying to sort of promote itself as a global climate leader. So in that context, it's worth knowing that we estimate that since the Paris Agreement was signed in 2016, that the UK government's put about £4 billion of public funds into fossil fuel projects in the global south. Now, the large majority of that comes from UK export finance, like Rachel mentioned, so a Trade Department institution that invests overseas to promote British business and exports. But about £700 million of it as well has come through the UK aid budget. So obviously UK aid and international development funds more generally are designed to reduce global poverty, and they have a legal requirement to meet the UK's obligations, both under the kind of sustainable development goals and to an extent the Paris Agreement. But nonetheless, UK aid has been sort of ploughed into fossil fuels in a way that I'm sure will probably surprise many. On the one hand, a lot of this goes through financial intermediaries and different infrastructure funds that the UK plays a big role in. So one example of that would be the Private Infrastructure Development Group. This is a fairly unaccountable kind of black box type fund that's not really, doesn't share a huge amount of information publicly about its activities. But the UK has given sort of 75% of this fund's funding since 2000, and it's a major financer of fossil fuels in the south. The UK also has its own fund that it calls the Prosperity Fund, which uses UK aid to promote British businesses in middle-income countries. That includes Mexico, China, India, Brazil, and it used this fund, or it has used this fund in recent years to expand oil and gas sector infrastructure quite significantly, although at a much smaller scale than the PIDG or UKEF. But the main sort of institution I want to really highlight in a minute is one called CDC Group. This is a development bank which is fully owned by the UK government. It's given aid by the government to invest overseas. So if you're a UK taxpayer, it's using kind of your public finances. And in this kind of period, in the past sort of decade or so, although CDC's talked quite a good game on stepping up its climate finance investments in green energy, at the same time, it's been giving plenty of money to fossil fuels as well. This includes quite a lot of money in the past few years to expand the gas sector in Bangladesh, with several new gas-powered power plants there. Again, expansion of gas power in Ghana and Cameroon. And the impacts of the gas projects in Ghana in particular are one to be worried about, as Ghana is facing a huge debt crisis at the minute, and is actually having to pay through the nose. The government pays very heavily to the private sector for this kind of gas project there. There's also been an expansion of heavy fuel oil power plants. So this is a particularly polluting form of oil, which has been burned in countries like Guinea, supported by UK public funds. And also a lot of transport and extractive industry infrastructure, which is supported by CDC. So this could be things like pipelines, ports, other bits of kind of infrastructure that help the extraction and transport of raw materials all around the world. And again, despite its kind of good rhetoric on cutting out coal finance, CDC has not really tackled this issue of transport infrastructure. Now, on this subject as a whole, we've had numerous press stories and a lot of work being done by campaigners over recent years. And every time we feel like we're getting to a moment where the UK is about to pull out of its fossil fuel finance, there seems to be a false promise and a false sort of horizon. I mean, it's over 10 years ago now that the Conservative Party of the British government promised to cut out UK export finance, fossil fuel financing, and it still hasn't done that to this day. CDC put out a new climate change strategy just this year, which was widely reported as an end to its fossil fuel subsidies. And yet an analysis of that shows that 90% of its current fossil fuel support would still be allowed under that new strategy. So there's a long way to go. There's a lot of work being done by campaigners and NGOs in the UK to put pressure on their government to bring an end to this practice. But I think really importantly, and the reason why we're here today is that we really need to make sure that our work here is linked to the struggles faced by frontline communities in the global south, particularly when it comes to the question of what comes next and how can this finance be redeployed to be used in a better way to tackle climate change rather than exacerbate it. But also for us to start thinking about the role of these public finance institutions and whether it's right to have kind of big financiers and private equity funds in the global north investing so heavily in energy, or if it's time for a new model which is not so heavily reliant on exports and extractivism. So with that, I'll hand back to Rachel, and yeah, looking forward to a good discussion.
Fabulous, thank you. I'm going to hand over to Laurie. So Laurie is a senior campaigner at Oil Change International. Her work focuses on ensuring a just transition through moving governments and financial institutions away from continuing to finance fossil fuels, especially around oil and gas. And previously, Laurie actually worked for Friends of the Earth Netherlands, where she led a climate court case, which is very exciting and you ought to look it up, against Shell. So is used to this kind of transnational, international working to hold kind of polluters and financiers accountable. So Laurie, I shall hand over to you.
Thanks so much, Rachel. And hi, everyone. I'm very excited to be here today to talk about my favorite topic, namely public finance and private finance that still flows to fossil fuels and how we can stop it. Yeah, my name is Laurie. I work as a senior campaigner at Oil Change International. Rachel just mentioned all of that. And I'm actually going to share a couple of slides with you to tell you a little bit more about the work that I do. So bear with me. Let me see, start presenting. That should work now. I indeed focus in my work on getting public finance institutions out of fossil fuels. And I just wanted to reiterate, and I'm sure that this is something that you all are very well aware of, but I just wanted to quickly explain why this work is so important and why it's so important that public finance institutions get out of fossil fuels. So currently there is too much oil, gas and coal that is in production already if we want to keep global heating limited to 1.5 degrees. So in this graph, you'll see that the emissions from coal, gas and oil reserves that are currently in production, so this is just a share of the existing reserves worldwide that are currently in production, that those emissions already exceed the carbon budgets for keeping global warming limited to 2 degrees, let alone 1.5 degrees. So that means that if we want to keep global warming limited to 1.5 degrees, we need to stop expanding fossil fuel production and we need to wind down existing production to make sure that we meet climate goals. But instead of doing that, governments and their public finance institutions are currently still propping up fossil fuels. So governments worldwide are planning to produce 120% more oil, gas and coal than compatible with the 1.5 degree limit. And they're also supporting this production with huge sums of public money. So we did a bit of data digging, and our research shows that governments of the G20 countries are still providing 3 times as much public finance for fossil fuels as for clean energy every year. So that's $77 billion a year that goes to supporting fossil fuel production, mostly from the global north to the global south. And these public finance institutions are multilateral development banks, such as the World Bank, development finance institutions, such as CDC Group that Daniel just talked about, and also export credit agencies that support national businesses with doing investments elsewhere abroad, like the UK Export Finance Institution that was also already mentioned. Fortunately, we're seeing that things are starting to shift slightly. So especially in the coal sector, we're seeing that more and more public finance institutions are getting out of coal. The public finance institutions in Asia were the biggest financiers of coal over the last few years, but also there we're seeing now that more and more institutions are getting out of coal. And some institutions are also taking steps to limit oil and gas finance. So you see a few examples here on the slide of banks that have completely moved out of fossil fuel finance, like Swedbank and the European Investment Bank, and banks that have limited finance for oil and gas production, so for the extraction. And that's the World Bank and the French Development Bank, for example. So last week, this was also already mentioned, there was a big summit, the Financing Commons Summit. That was the first Global Development Bank Summit that brought together all these institutions to talk about how they could support a just recovery and a green recovery, and how they can contribute to reaching the climate goals. And in the lead up to that summit at OCI and working with many partners across the world, we organized to make sure that our expectations for that summit were very clearly communicated, and to make sure that the banks participating in that summit and organizing the summit knew that what we expected from them. And that included, among also other calls, a need to stop funding fossils and to make clear commitments around stopping public financing for dirty energy. So we launched a joint statement and launched op-eds, and even also got the UN to make some announcements around the need for this summit to deliver on ending fossil fuel finance. And unfortunately, we didn't get any concrete commitments around ending fossil fuel investments at the summit, which is something that we also didn't necessarily expect, considering the large variety of banks that were participating in this summit. But we did, I think, manage very well in kind of framing the narrative around the summit and making sure that it was very clear that climate leadership in this day and age also means ending not just coal financing, but also oil and gas. So as you'll see in these headlines, this was also something that was picked up by journalists when they covered the summit after it closed on Thursday. And I think I can also end this introduction on a more positive note, because despite we didn't get that very clear commitment from all of these banks around ending fossil fuel finance, we did get the European Investment Bank to say that they want to cooperate with other banks on ending fossil fuel finance. We did get CSOs from across the human rights and development and climate and gender constituencies to work together and to speak with one united voice on this issue. And we did manage to frame the narrative. And as we look forward, I think that there is definitely an opportunity to build on the work that we've done on this up till now, and the work that is being done in the UK, as we're still expecting an announcement from the UK around ending fossil fuel finance. And if you consider that Biden has won the election in the US, he in his campaign promised to end dirty energy finance. So there are some openings there to continue to work on this issue and to get banks to work together to stop funding fossils in the lead up to COP26. So looking forward to talk about that more with all of you on today's workshop. So, and here are some resources. I can also share the slides with all of you if that's of interest. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much, Laurie, for that overview. And yeah, I think good, definitely to highlight that there is some positive movement on this, and definitely that we're starting to see civil society speaking with something of a united voice, but there's still definitely a long way to go on that. So on that note, I'll introduce our next speaker. So Ilham Rawood works for Justica Ambiental, Friends of the Earth Mozambique, and is a coordinator for the Say No to Gas campaign. And I think a couple of the questions in the chat mentioned if we could highlight cases of kind of the impacts of UCAS financing in the global south, which is exactly what I think Gilham's going to talk about with specific reference to Mozambique. Please take it away, Ilham.
Thanks, Daniel. And thanks for having me on this amazing panel and this great program. So yeah, Larry gave a really good idea of the financing sphere, and Mozambique is a really good example of the impacts of this financing. So about 13 years ago, Anadarko, which is an American company that no longer exists, discovered 10 trillion cubic feet of gas. And they've now, they're currently 3 big projects: the Mozambique LNG project, Coral LNG project, and Rovuma LNG project. And because there's so many, because there are these 3 projects in the gas industry, it's very easy for financiers, be it private or public, to sort of confuse the issue, you know, so we can't see exactly who's funding what and how much they're funding. And this makes it, this is definitely an advantage for them. So what you've got with this industry is, you know, the textbook issues that come with the extractive industry. It's people losing their homes and their livelihoods, being, it's fishing and farming communities who's, you know, who's without that. And now seeing as they've been promised jobs, that none of these are happening, they're, you know, they're left with nothing. So people are extremely poor in the region, the gas region, which is Cabo Delgado. And you've probably heard about it in the news a lot for not just the gas, which is now being, the main project is being run by Total. The others are Eni and Exxon. It's also been in the news a lot because of the insurgent attacks that have been taking place. And but what you don't really read about is the militarization and the Mozambican military, the international military that's coming in to support them to sort of get rid of the insurgents. But Exxon and Total they provided more money to the Mozambican government specifically to deploy more soldiers in Cabo Delgado, which is quite clearly to protect them. And these, we know of incidences of, because we work really closely with communities on the ground, when we have staff who are based in communities, we know of instances of women being sexually assaulted by the military, the army extorting people who they know have received compensation from Total, and saying, so if you don't give us your compensation money, then we're going to kidnap your daughters. And Total know, the companies know all about this, but pretend that they don't. And so you've got, it's you know, the typical weird sort of developed country idea of we need to provide financing for African governments and African countries who can't, you know, survive without us. And so some of the big finances, big state finances here are, you know, UK Export-Import Bank, which actually under Trump's watch gave $5 billion US dollars to the Mozambique LNG project last year, which is the biggest project in the biggest loan in history. And so it's also the South African Export Credit Insurance Corporation. There's the ECAs of Italy, Japan, Korea, Portugal. It's and as well as state pension funds. So in Sweden, for example, the pension funds are state-owned. All of them invest in Mozambique gas. So yeah, it's really a matter of, and when you try and talk to, like, the idea that always, you know, comes across from these, or that these banks, financial banks, that these banks are usually, sorry, would say is, you know, like we're providing financing that is needed, but at the same time, you're dealing with a government here that is highly corrupt. And it's what they also say, especially with private companies, when you raise the fact that the money that, you know, Mozambique is one of the biggest energy producers in Africa, and yet it's still 27% of the population has access to electricity. And when banks know this, and yet continue to give this money to the government and say it's for development of the people. I mean, either they don't Google anything, or they are just, just really don't care. And when I said this to to one of the gas companies, they say, but Africa is corrupt, and what we do with our money, what they do with the money that we give them via tax or the income that they receive is not our problem. And when you're dealing with a government that is so corrupt, like, Mozambique it's been in the news over the last few years for a massive illegal debt scandal, for which they credit Swiss bankers that are in prison, and the former finance minister is in custody in South Africa. It's notorious it's factually notorious for corruption. And by UK, US, massive developed countries investing in fossil fuels there, it's rewarding this corruption, it's enabling impunity. So that idea of financing for development is just rubbish. Yeah.
Great, thank you, Ilham. That's really a good reminder of kind of why we need to be supporting those frontline communities in their struggle, and also the sort of pressing urgency of that right away. Just noticed one question in the chat asking about the recent Paris Peace Forum discussions. I think it's worth pointing out that actually was connected to the Financing Commons Summit. So the kind of discussions that Laurie was referring to earlier was part of those Paris Peace Forum meetings, just in case there's any confusion on that. But next up, in terms of how we, this is a really good example of how we can connect these struggles and push forward with them, both in the South and in the global North. We're going to have contribution from Rachel, who you've all already met. Rachel's already introduced herself, so I won't do that again. But she's going to speak about the court case that Friends of the Earth, England, Wales and Northern Ireland are bringing against the British government, specifically on this Mozambique case, and why it's important that people take action here in the UK to hold their government accountable. So whenever you're ready, Rachel.
Brilliant, thank you. So Friends of the Earth, England, Wales and Northern Ireland have been working with JAR, Friends of the Earth Mozambique, on tackling the UK's contribution to the Mozambique LNG project. And there's a few reasons why we want to do that. One of them is that kind of like really showing that the UK is responsible for more than our domestic emissions, right? That we can't just look within our borders. We have to kind of like lift our attention and our work above that to the international impact of the UK, particularly when you consider the UK's kind of historical responsibility for climate change. So looking historically, the UK is the 5th highest contributor to climate change in the world, and we still need to help clean up that mess in proportion to that contribution. So we want to do that. We also want to do it because the UK really does get away with funding these projects with all their human rights, social, environmental kind of issues, that because they're pushed out of sight into a different country, that a lot of the UK public doesn't know about. So we have been working with Ilham and with Friends of the Earth Mozambique to bring this court case to challenge the UK's financial contribution, which was decided earlier this year and will be $1 billion worth of financing. So we've brought we filed a legal claim, and on the grounds of that we don't think it's in line with climate change commitments. So actually on that climate change ground, similar to a case we brought about Heathrow Airport earlier in the last couple of years. So there's climate change grounds. There's also environmental and human rights grounds that the consequences of these projects aren't in line with our responsibilities as a country, but also on transparency, because these projects, if you look at the government website about the Mozambique LNG decision to support it, it still says it's being considered, and that hasn't been updated for a good few months. And there's actually very little transparency about this process, looking at the kind of which reports are actually publicly available. So it's kind of this slightly hidden process that the UK does to fund polluting fuels elsewhere. And it does this because it knows it would be unpopular. So it keeps it quite quiet. So yeah, we've got this legal case. We've recently resubmitted our revised grounds, and we should know whether we can go ahead early next year with that. So keep an eye out for news on that. We've also been working with lots of other groups, including Global Justice Now and many others, on the political side of this. So the government has, as Daniel's mentioned, the government has kind of been promising this review of fossil fuel financing overseas for years, and it keeps getting delayed. So we're working on this policy review, hoping to get the UK to commit to phasing out all of its support for oil and gas overseas. And I think I'll leave you with just kind of a number from a report we did recently, or rather somebody mentioned in the comments about kind of when these projects have gone wrong, right, and UK financing. And I don't have any kind of like, certainly like obviously they go wrong because of the environmental consequences, human rights, social, they go wrong because of that all the time. But there's also a huge financial risk involved, right? Like, because investing in fossil fuels isn't good financial sense, and certainly, yeah, because they were not going to be profitable long term. And actually there was a report that came out a couple of weeks ago about the jobs that could be created if the amount of money we put into financing fossil fuels was moved into cleaner technologies, clean energy, and it's up to around 42,000 new jobs. So it makes better compared to a very low number of jobs in fossil fuels. So it makes sense makes business sense, it makes ethical sense, it makes sense in line with our kind of historical responsibility, and obviously it makes sense for driving climate change, to kind of get our funding out of this as quickly as possible and start moving it into the things that we need. So climate adaptation, climate finance, mitigation, and helping support countries deal with the impacts of climate change, and also move beyond fossil fuels as well. I'm going to leave it there, I think.
Great, thank you, Rachel, for that. So now is going to be the sort of part of the session where we move into Q&A and more of a discussion between us. And we've had some great questions come in from the audience so far, which we're just taking note of, and we will get to them in a second. But just, I think, first of all, I think we've talked quite a bit about the need to stop this fossil fuel finance, and we've highlighted some of the problems with that and some of the very good arguments why governments should move out of fossil fuels. But that does beg the question, what are the alternatives, and what should these public funds what should these public funds be used for instead? A lot of governments at the minute are talking of their commitments on climate finance without really kind of defining very strongly what exactly that means. And certainly throughout the rest of the kind of global gathering this weekend, there's been some really useful sessions on some of the false solutions to climate change, and why investments in, for example, hydropower might have their own problems and impacts on communities. So I just wanted to put out that question to the other speakers first, if they had any thoughts on what are the alternatives and what should this financing be spent on instead. Shall I come to Laurie first?
Sure, thanks, Daniel. Yeah, what are the alternatives? I think that Rachel just already gave a very good example when she mentioned the report that came out a couple of weeks ago that looked at how many jobs can be created by investing in renewables versus the jobs that are created by investing the same amount of money in fossil fuels. So that doesn't just apply to the UCAP's financing, to the financing provided by the UK Export Credit Agency, but that typically applies all across the world. So for every dollar that gets invested, or every euro or every pound or whatsoever that gets invested in the energy sector, more jobs are created by investing that dollar in renewables than by investing that dollar in fossil fuels. So there are huge opportunities there to shift money away from fossils to clean energy and create the jobs that we need to build back better from this COVID-19 crisis. But then, of course, there are also many other sectors that require investments, and particularly in those countries that are reliant on fossil fuels for government revenue, and that are therefore also very vulnerable to shocks in the oil and gas markets. So there are many countries, especially also in the global south, like Nigeria, like Venezuela, that are reliant on fossil fuels for 80% of government revenue, and it makes them very, very vulnerable to shocks in those oil and gas markets. So there's a really a crucial need to invest money in diversifying those economies so they become less vulnerable. And there's of course then also the need to invest in a just transition away from fossil fuels, so to also make sure that people that lose their jobs are supported in the transition and supported to find new opportunities, find new sectors that they can work for. But in all of this, I think it's really crucial to also respond to local needs. And for that, banks, whether they are public or private banks, need to really engage with local communities to find out what their needs are. And that is also something that we currently see is not really happening, at least not sufficiently enough. So it's really important that when banks make investments, that they speak to the local communities to find out what they want, because in that case, they will often also find in the energy sector that the local communities actually don't want to see these massive investments in the fossil fuel sector, but rather prefer distributed renewable energy or whatsoever, or prefer investments in their healthcare system, in education. So yeah, I'll leave it there.
Great, thank you, Laurie. And Ilham, I don't know if you just wanted to comment on that question.
What Laurie said. I think, yes, the renewables, of course. I mean, Mozambique has like solar and hydro for days. And what's also really important that she said at the end was working with communities to understand what they need, and it's not a generic need across Mozambique. So in rural areas, what we would advocate for is for them to invest in in assisting the development of small-scale community-led power production. And it's not up to UKEF or to any public financer to decide, or foreign financer to decide, how Mozambicans should be getting their energy. And also, I think a lot of it is, and as well as to bring, if there's going to be financing in renewables or in any kind of energy production, not fossils, of course, then there needs to be a real effort and seriousness put into creating training, good training and good skills creation for communities, so that they can have jobs that are long-term and sustainable, not sort of temporary menial jobs as people are currently having. But there's also, and this is where you cannot forget the colonial aspect and destruction, that has come from the extractive industry. I mean, some of the land in Mozambique cannot be farmed because it's still poisoned by the cotton plantations of Portuguese colonizers. This is something that needs to be dealt with, and I think there's also a lot to be said for not where you spend your money, but where you don't spend your money. So investing in, like I said, in a government that is corrupt is a problem. And just by holding back that money, it's saying a lot. And also financing, like Laurie said again, diversifying the financing, so that it doesn't always necessarily benefit. I mean, the financing of fossil fuel extraction, aside from that, terrible rhetoric as a ruse for, mutually exclusive benefit of we're financing for the Mozambican government. It's also we're financing for ourselves. So the head of BPI, which is the French public investor, when we had a meeting with them last year and explained the issues that French financing of Technip at the time, the French engineering company, the impact that this was having on the industry, he said, our priority is not human rights and the environment, our priority is French employment. And so if there was really a want to invest in development or in bettering the lives of Mozambicans, then it should go into education and into housing and into sustainable and safe power production. Or it shouldn't go into anything at all.
Brilliant, thank you. And just to also highlight, there's actually some of the people who've been mentioning some of the climate finance and things like that in the comments, which is also something we ought to be doing, right? Like there's, I mentioned the UK's historic responsibility on climate change, and actually there was some research published late last year around what that scale looks like, and actually it found that if the UK reached zero emissions by 2030, which we are not on track for that, but even if it did that, it would still have to do the same amount of climate action internationally to make up for its fair share of climate action. So we do need to be investing or spending and using our money for good internationally, but it has to abide by all these kind of the things that people have just said, right? It has to be kind of specific, locally specific, and it has to be not what we determine or the UK determines it to be. And climate finance is one of those, one of the things that can be done for that. And climate finance is kind of spending to help countries kind of move to clean energy, but also adapt to climate change and deal with the consequences of climate change that we can't avoid. It would also, forgive me for this question because I am a COP nerd, but it would be really, I'd like to hear from some of the panelists or the speakers about how this subject relates to kind of like that, the COP that's coming up next year in the UK, and the discussions that are going on inside COP, if you have a view on that, and what some of the opportunities are for us to work on this in the next year, just to link it back to kind of the COP26 coalition. So I don't know, Laurie or Ilham or Daniel, if anybody has any kind of thoughts on opportunities in the run up to COP, or how this links with some of the big issues that will be in focus around COP.
I mean, I'll jump in quickly, I suppose. So, I mean, climate finance is obviously one of the big issues that's approached at COP as well. It was raised in a really useful session yesterday, actually, that a lot of the climate finance being pushed forward by governments at the minute is in the form of loans. And I know we've had comments in the discussion about the importance of debt cancellation as well, and the large amounts of external debt that a lot of countries in the global south hold at the minute. So at the minute we have a situation during the global pandemic where about 60 countries around the world are paying more servicing their external debt than they are in public healthcare. International institutions are more or less sort of washing their hands of this situation. There's been sort of some limited suspension of debt payments from between governments, but not to multilateral institutions or the private sector. And then on top of this, you have kind of rich countries in the global north, offering to help with the transition to renewable energy, but only in the form of loans and increasing that debt. So to connect those issues back to the UK's fair share of climate change and that historic responsibility. I think it's really important to be pushing, outside of COP and inside as well where possible, for that finance to be in the form of grants and not to be adding to the debt burden of the global south, which is, already in many ways, has very deep colonial roots.
Can I add something as well? Also, I think we need to also push for the gas is not a transition fuel, continuation of that discussion. I know it's boring, but it still needs to, continue to do that. And also, I think continuously linking climate to and 2 degrees and 1.5 degrees to human rights, because they are interlinked. Like, totally interlinked. And I think we need to keep bringing back the people element and to what climate change means. And also, I think with that, just pushing with using the term like climate injustice and climate refugees and climate racism as well, which are terms that they need to face, I think, and need to dissect. So I think we need to sort of change the change the rhetoric by which we advocate around COP, and therefore sort of change the rhetoric that they use within COP, that the media, which makes the media sort of forced to use this rhetoric within itself as well, I think.
Sounds good, thank you. Laurie, do you want to come in on this at all? You don't have to.
Maybe very briefly, just to mention that the Paris Agreement doesn't mention fossil fuels at all. And for a very long time, the topic was also not really discussed explicitly at the COPs. But over the last few years, of course, thanks to the pressure from movements, it's gotten a lot more attention also at the COPs or in the sidelines of the COPs. And I think last year was a really interesting COP where even many of the negotiators and people who are very much from working on the inside were saying that a lot more of the exciting stuff was actually happening on the sidelines of the COP, in the movement spaces, and where people were really thinking about innovative solutions. We're really thinking about working locally, and we're really having the energy that is needed to break through the stalemate that we're currently in this world, and to build that better world. And that energy really was in those movement spaces and not necessarily in the COP buildings itself. And it was also positive to see that the need to restrict fossil fuel production and to need to really address that dirty side of our energy system, that did come up more at the COP, also thanks to the release of this production gap report from the UN energy or from the UN Environment Programme, from UNEP. I'll just leave it there.
Thanks. I think there's also an issue, or it's also good, somebody mentioned in the comments about false solutions, right? Especially around agribusinesses and kind of the commodification of nature and kind of solid biofuels and things like that. And there is one thing to flag for the upcoming COP is there is this big discussion around how you basically negative emissions technologies and how you draw down emissions as well as reducing emissions. And this is similar to the gas as a transition fuel argument, kind of a really dangerous distraction, but also somewhere where companies can make a lot of money. So that is somewhere to watch for things for financing as well. So even if it's not kind of just labeled as fossil fuels, coal, oil and gas, there's projects out there that are supposedly climate friendly that we also need to be looking at, kind of where our government's putting money and relying on them in their own climate plans. Maybe we should be positive for a bit. It would be good to hear from people about what progress has been made in recent years on this, and how, this session is under the Linking Struggles part of the programme, right? So how has linking struggles across borders helped make progress in this area? And I think kind of Mozambique LNG is a really good example of this, because there are so many different agencies and institutions involved. This isn't a simple kind of it's not a simple thing that we in the UK or kind of people in Mozambique could solve by themselves. This has to be an international effort. So I wonder, Ilham, if we could come to you to say a little bit about what progress has been made, if any, either on Mozambique LNG or other projects, and how linking struggles across borders is valuable. Ilham?
Sure. I mean, our can you hear me?
Yes.
Hello. We good? Okay. Sorry, it's developing country internet. No, I'm kidding. So we are going for about 3 years now, because it suddenly, the gas industry blew up, and as I mean, all of you, I mean, Rachel, you know as well very much how it's just exploded over the last few years, and it's very difficult to keep up with them. I think what's been really good about this campaign is that it focuses a lot on not NGOs and struggles across borders, not on doing, but on supporting. So people in Mozambique are fighters, you know, but it's just been so difficult to resist within. So about a year ago, I think there was there was a preschool with some 6-year-olds who were doing a little protest outside against litter, and the cops shut it down. So the idea of, you know, rural Mozambicans fighting the government against fossil fuel extraction is, you know, it's a bit far. So what's been really great is that we've, with the people that we work with really closely on the ground, the communities who are dealing with this all the time, it's been really nice to have that voice amplified by our partners. And what this has meant is, so in Denmark this year, one of the organizations that we work with, we had a lobby tour where we spoke to the public and to activists about how pretty much all the Danish pension funds invest in Exxon or Eni or Total, at least 2 of the companies that are in Mozambique. What came out of that was that quite a couple of people who were involved in those pension funds called the pension funds to say they would pull their money if they didn't divest. So that's really nice. Also, when people in some of the communities on the ground have written letters to Total in Mozambique and in the gas region, and they haven't responded, we then work with partners to then contact Total head office and say, sorry, these people sent you a letter and this was your non-response. Like, what's the deal? So that's been really helpful. I also think like international media is really great, especially when we're really the only ones who are telling the truth about the militarization and about what soldiers are doing to people that is not in the mainstream media. And there are not that many NGOs based in Cabo Delgado, you know. Many of the NGOs in the gas region are either paid by the government or by the companies. So I think, and there's one other thing that's been really great is it's really important for us that, and I really see this and I feel this with our work, that companies listen a lot more to people with European passport than they do to a Mozambican, and that our partners in countries where these companies and finances are based, so it would be HSBC, it would be Total in France and the French banks, HSBC, Centrica, BP in the UK, Eni in Italy, our partners have they have shares, or they've bought shares in these companies, so that when it comes to AGMs, they can go and they can ask questions where they've taken information that we've given them and said, well, actually, we know you're doing this in Mozambique and you cannot bullshit us anymore because we work with people who see it all the time. And that's also really helpful, being able to take the struggles of the people on the ground to very high level internationally that we might not be able to do ourselves. So yeah, so that's been really great.
Fantastic, thank you. Laurie or Dan, would you like to come in on this one?
Yeah, maybe very briefly to say that I think that for the work we're doing to get public finance out of fossil fuels and out of harmful projects, it's really important to connect struggles. What we're hearing a lot from public finance institutions is that they're doing this to bring economic development to regions, and that it's that they're investing in these projects so that local communities can benefit from those investments. And only when we work with the communities that are affected by these investments and the NGOs that are on the ground and that can see what is actually happening on the ground, then we can tell the story of how these projects are not benefiting local communities. So I think that as someone based in Amsterdam and working internationally, it's really, really important to work with NGOs on the ground to get a better understanding of what's actually happening on the ground, and to make sure that we can integrate that perspective in the work that we do. So, and another reason why it's really important to connect struggles is that these banks are also often looking at the other banks to see what they are doing. So that can also really help to raise the pressure on them. If I hear from a colleague who's based in Denmark, who's working on the Danish ECA, that they're developing new policy to restrict oil and gas financing, then I can use that to talk to the Dutch Development Bank to tell them that there is this other bank that are taking steps. You surely don't want to be a laggard. You also want to be in the lead on this. So do take action. Yeah, it can also be helpful to raise the pressure on banks to kind of show to positive examples that we see at a number of banks that are taking action.
Great, thank you. Dan, do you want to say anything on this?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I suppose first of all, I just echo everything that Laurie and Ilham have said already, and I won't try to kind of repeat that. But I mean, yeah, I think there's also the question of linking struggles, not just across borders, but between some of these different types of damaging investments. And I know we've had a bit of mention already in the chat about damaging investments in agro industry. Different false solutions that are around, and the role of different kind of international actors beyond the UK and European governments, bodies like the World Bank and IMF. And I think it's really important for us to kind of link the sort of stop fossil fuel struggle with a broader vision of climate justice, and make sure that that finance isn't just transferred into, for example, the expansion of cobalt mining in DR Congo. This is something that's kind of really used for green technology, quite important in sort of renewable tech. And you can imagine a sort of a scenario in which the World Bank says, okay, we're going to make sure we stop financing oil and gas, but we're going to put it all into other extractive industries or into big agro, and sort of plantations that look at other kind of commodities. So I think it's really important for us to connect the dots of those struggles as well. It's not just about fossil fuels, although that's a big priority. It's about challenging the kind of economic system that we have, and particularly one that's kind of predicated on extracting wealth and resources from the global south for the benefit of the north. So I'd just encourage us to be thinking about that at the same time as well.
Can I just say something on that quickly?
Please.
I think it's also really important to recognize that when there's an extractive industry, it's not just gas companies. It's also auxiliary, like really destructive auxiliary industries that, that it's like a gold mine for them. So the private security and mercenary industry is massive in Mozambique, in Cabo Delgado. Also plastics, and now we'll talk about agribusiness. Yara, which is a massive Norwegian agrochemicals firm, they've got an agreement to purchase gas, which they're going to convert into fertilizer. And we have heard from communities who've lost their land, or they've gotten pieces of land where they used to have 10 hectares and now have 1 hectare. They told us about the company called Yara, who's going to be teaching them how to farm more on less. So it's very much an interlinked struggle here. So we often try to work with people who are working on security issues, working on agribusiness, working on plastics, because it's really important that we don't work on silos, because this is how they get to not take responsibility, and the further away the industries are from each other, it's very easy for Yara to say, oh, but we're not responsible for anything that Total's doing on the ground, when actually you are as responsible, because without a purchaser, this project wouldn't be able to happen. And you are also maximizing on the human rights violations that these people are facing. So I think that's also really important.
Fantastic, thank you. I'm going to quickly kind of skim through some of the questions you've been asking in the chat box, because some of them have quite short answers, so I can perhaps tick some of them off. There has also been a lot of answers in the chat box with research and references and things like that, so do have a read there, because there's a lot of information and some really great reports linked in there as well. So yeah, there's some questions about the how does kind of this work connect to kind of movements calling for debt cancellations and reparations and climate debt. Yeah, it's really clearly linked, especially through kind of that kind of historic responsibility, kind of past actions. And actually it's a shame Liddy can't be here, because her organisation has recently published a statement signed by lots of global South movements and groups, calling for the end of financing fossil fuels and other harmful projects, and also the cancellation of debt. Right, so and I put a link to their letter into the box a little while ago, so it should be in there. But there is this kind of big active call for debt cancellation and kind of this idea of climate finance or climate reparations, so moving money from countries that have benefited from burning fossil fuels to those who now need to skip that phase, or kind of go straight to renewable energy and clean energy. So yeah, they're completely linked. There was a question about kind of where do you get good information and good trustworthy information about this sort of stuff, and how people might be able to find out how much money is invested. So we linked to a few reports in the box, and it's worth saying OCI, so Laurie's organisation, also does a lot of work on subsidies. So the UK government funds fossil fuels overseas, but it's still also financially supporting fossil fuels in the UK as well. And so there's a lot of work going on that. So there's lots of good information via OCI. I can recommend looking there. We also link to a few other reports in the chat box. My personal experience of getting trustworthy information about this sort of thing out of the government has been frustrating, as I'm sure you can imagine. This isn't something that they're particularly open about, especially individual projects. Like, as you can tell from the Mozambique LNG example, they haven't been open or transparent about that at all. So there is a real push for getting more information through freedom of information requests. MPs can be useful in this because they can put pressure on government to try and kind of build that pressure to release information, because at the moment it's not very transparent, presumably because it would be deeply unpopular if it was more kind of had more public scrutiny. I think that brings me on to a question that somebody also asked around what are the best kind of pressure points that we can actually put pressure on as campaigners, which I'd love to hear from our speakers about. Yeah, where are those points where we can really apply pressure to improve this situation? Does anybody want to come in on that?
I can go. I think like I said it before, that whenever we speak to companies and financiers that are involved, when we raise the human rights issue, it's often the first time that they've heard about it, So because there's so much conversation in Europe and the US about climate, they have a lot of great, rubbish back like rhetoric that they can throw back and dialogue that they can throw back that they've already prepped for, But when it comes to human rights, it's very difficult for them to actually, like give you something back without sounding like complete morons, because they really don't know what they're talking about. So I think that's something that we really need to move into, is talking about the issues that people are literally facing. And then also what we're doing, what we've done with FOUS is taking this to friendly parliamentarians. So asking questions I'm not sure in everybody's country how it works, but in South Africa, you can, which is where I am now, you can get friendly parliamentarians to ask questions in Parliament, which then gets recorded in the minutes, which then can go to the media. And it's where, so for example, you can ask our Export Credit Agency why, so the Department of Trade and Industry, for example, why they're financing a project that does and there are laws around when they have to respond to you by a certain date. So I think that's also a way that we can get our issues raised in a way that it has to be answered. And again, I think for people, especially in developed countries, linking, so explaining to people, making it clear to them how their banks and their tax money is actually financing human rights violations and climate change, because I don't think people always see the link, and sort of making them see this, like literally how every time you put money in your bank, it's not your fault, of course, literally every time you put money in your bank, this is what it's being used for. I think that link is also really important.
Fabulous, thank you. Dan or Laurie?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in quickly. So, I think what we've got here is this really interesting but difficult sort of alliance between bits of the private sector, private finance, and then the backing of governments and international institutions on the public side all around the world. So, that gives us kind of more opportunities in a way. Ilham's completely right. Hitting banks sort of through their shareholders or trying to attack their brand and their reputation can sometimes be quite effective, and that's got sort of one way to do it. But on the public side, it's really difficult, partly because of the lack of information that's publicly available. You can submit freedom of information requests and ask certain questions of your MPs, as you have a right to do. But quite often the government hides behind this question of commercial sensitivity, and it has a legal right to refuse kind of information in some cases. One example is that we're quite worried that because there's been a lot of public pressure on this issue recently, the UK Export Finance might be about to try and rush through a lot of investment in oil and gas in the next few years. But it doesn't have to disclose any information about that at all, because it can say that it would threaten its investment if they were to publicly disclose their plans. So in terms of pressure points, what do we do? We've been working closely with MPs, trying to get them to raise it in Parliament. But I think definitely now is the time for us to be thinking beyond Parliament in the run-up to COP to make this a big public issue. And I think really calling into question that the hypocrisy particularly around the UK government, but also other governments, about saying that they're climate leaders and they're taking action on climate change. The government here is going to try and use COP as a huge opportunity to boost its reputation around the world and make it seem like a great international actor. I think we really have to attack that at every opportunity and highlight that it's not quite how they present it, and that any exposure of that will call them into action to some extent.
Fantastic, thank you. I just want to address one other question from the chat, and then I will well, two questions actually. So the first one was around the conflict of interest within the COP process, within the UN climate talks, which they don't have one, which is a problem. And there are groups like Corporate Responsibility in the US who are really working to try and get a corporate a conflict of interest policy into the UNFCCC. That's a campaign worth checking out. But it's also worth this is another one of those links, right, to another campaign, which is the fossil free politics groups looking at where corporations are allowed to influence. So there's fossil free politics, and there's also Glasgow calls out polluters, which is particularly a COP26 focused group. So yeah, that's another place that we need to put our efforts in the coming year for sure. The final question that I was just going to ask from the box, which maybe Dan, you can speak on this, is about UK aid and whether it's in the form of loans or not.
Yeah, so it really depends. Certainly some UK aid goes in the form of loans. CDC, who I was talking about before, makes some loans to companies to expand their operations. That's sort of something that they've started doing relatively recently. A lot of funding is kind of programmatic, so fund a particular program. I mean, one of the really ridiculous things, I suppose, in a way, is that the UK government spends millions, or was given millions to Mozambique in recent years. I think mainly through kind of NGOs, but they've run programs through UK aid to protect against extreme weather and to build climate resilience. And at the same time, they've just given $1 billion loan to a project, in the same country to expand gas operations. But I mean, on the question about loans, I think it's really important to highlight that this isn't necessarily money it's almost never actually money going to a government. CDC invests in the private sector. Quite often it does that through private equity funds. So there's kind of financial intermediaries and private companies all in this process who quite often are based in tax havens. So it's not only a question of the bad environmental consequences of these investments, but the profits from it and the money actually comes straight back out of countries through kind of tax evasion and avoidance. So it's not even as good as a loan, because governments never see a lot of this money in the first place. It just goes to private corporations.
Fantastic. Dan, I'm actually going to hand back over to you to do the final things.
Great. Well, we're almost at the end of our session, so thank you everyone who's stuck with us so far. I mean, I thought that for the last 10 minutes, we'd just come around again one last time to each of the speakers to highlight any key actions that people in the audience can take, ways to kind of carry on the discussion after today, and maybe ways that we can sort of make a bit more progress in the run up to COP next year. Also, I mean, I'll invite Ilham and Laurie, I don't know if you want to sort of just summarize the state of play of where we're at now, and again, any sort of key ways that people can show their solidarity or also support the campaigns that you're running at the minute. So Laurie, I think we'll come to you for any sort of final reflections on those themes.
Yeah, and I'll try to end on a bit more of a positive note. I think there is a key opportunity now to build on the momentum created by the European Investment Bank that got out of fossil fuel financing last year, and that is working really hard on its roadmap to become a climate bank, and looking at all other sorts of issues such as contributing towards social justice and working better with local communities in making their investment decisions, etc. I think that building on that, there is an opportunity to showcase some of these positive examples and bring those banks that are willing to really show leadership on this together to form kind of a leadership coalition and show how it's done. And with, of course, Biden hopefully entering the White House, there will also be better opportunities for international collaboration on this issue and more leadership also from the US. Although there is, of course, a lot of work that needs to be done and also pressure that needs to be raised on also Biden to make sure that he actually delivers on those promises. And some key actions people can take, I think specifically in the UK, it's really worthwhile to continue to raise the pressure on the UK government to finally make that announcement around ending overseas fossil fuel finance, because that can help build that momentum that we need to deliver action on this. And indeed get involved in all of those really great campaigns that are being built in the lead up to COP to get fossil fuels companies out of the COP, and to raise issues, the debt issue, etc. There are many very exciting campaigns that are being built and many opportunities to get engaged. So fossil-free culture, that's another a great campaign that works to kind of undermine the social license of the fossil fuel industry. That's another one that you can get involved in. A lot of exciting opportunities out there. So get involved, take action.
Great, thank you, Laurie. And Ilham, we'll come to you next.
Yeah, thanks. And thanks, Larry. And I think with the, I mean, we're currently in a place in Mozambique where some of the projects have already been financed, and some have, sorry, let me switch this off. Some have already been financed and some are still considering financing. So it would be, I mean, I'm going to put my email address in, definitely get in touch with Rachel as well. Sorry, Rachel, I'm just offering you up there. And I think when it comes to, yeah, so like what I said was talking to the state through Parliament, or in the US and through Congress. And also if you're involved with your pension funds, getting in touch with them, threatening to pull your money out with you, I think, and a lot of it is also, sorry to sort of hijack this, but private companies as well. So if you have shares in Total or HSBC or any of the banks that are involved, then buy share and then go to the annual general meetings and say your say. Try and get information from them that you can then share with us. Like, for example, we're always looking for environmental impact assessments that we're not receiving. You know, talk to us before an AGM, talk to us about how to buy a share, and then, you know, we can work together on what is it that we need help on. This is what you can ask as a shareholder. This is what you can try and access for us as a shareholder. Also, social media, if you have a foot in with mainstream media, even alternative media, who needs to be writing about what's honestly happening on the ground and not just what the current agenda is, then do put them in touch with us as well. It's really about, we do a lot of work, and it's really about amplifying that and taking that to people who have the power to make decisions. Yeah.
Great, thank you, Ilham. I think it's worth pointing out, I've just posted a link to the programme for the rest of this global gathering in the chat. And if anyone's really keen to follow up on some of those things that Ilham mentioned right away, there's a session at 4:30 p.m. UK time today on cleaning up our pensions, linking Indigenous struggles and Scottish finance, which I believe will have speakers from Ecuador and elsewhere in the Global South, and also from campaigners in Scotland. So that's another linking struggles session that will kind of build on some of the things we've talked about today. Rachel, would you like to give any sort of final closing reflections and maybe ways people can support either the legal case or Friends of the Earth campaigning?
So we have a petition, which is we will be handing in quite soon to try and influence the government before Christmas. So I will paste a link to that in the chat box. But really, especially around the legal case, it's very much we will definitely need support and help around that probably next year. So it's keeping an eye on things. And really, I think one of the key things to be doing is, whenever there is public or things are revealed in public, making sure we're amplifying those stories as much as possible, because the government is embarrassed about this, and there is a lot of people in the government and lots of departments who don't want this sort of financing to keep going ahead. And so it is kind of making sure that they are embarrassed enough publicly to get this over the line and stop this financing as quickly as possible.
Great, thank you, Rachel, for that. Now, we've posted quite a lot of links in the chat to various kind of resources and things. We will be sending around a few of those resources afterwards, particularly in kind of ways people can get involved, some of the actions you can take, and some of the kind of key bits of research. So look out for an email to arrive in your inbox soon with that. There's also been a link to the Slack channel been posted in discussion. That's a kind of online platform where we can carry on having the conversation, and again we can post the resources. But if there's anything that you're struggling to find or more kind of specific questions, I think each of the speakers has now posted their email in the chat as well. So feel free to contact us with any kind of follow-up questions. But with that, I'd just like to thank everyone once again for taking part. It's great to see so many people on a Sunday. Thanks for giving up some of your weekend to sort of join us in this discussion. And please do, take a look at the Global Gathering Programme. There's loads of great events on this evening, if you're in the UK and Europe, and also tomorrow on Monday as well. So thank you everyone for a great discussion, some very important and challenging questions, and hope to speak with you soon, either in the Slack or over email about the subject. Thank you.
Thanks all.